Did you know that the LDS Church eliminated a high office in the church in 1979? Now, it's not an office that very many people know much about, but it was at one point second in authority only to the president of the church himself. That office was called the Presiding Patriarch, or the Patriarch to the church. The office was so significant that in 1839, Joseph Smith said this about it: "Whenever the Church of Christ is established in the earth, there should be a patriarch for the benefit of the posterity of the saints." And this wasn't just Joseph. Brigham Young said something very similar in 1847. He said, "It was necessary to keep up a full organization of the church through all time as far as could be. At least the 3 first presidency, quorum of the 12, 70s, and patriarch over the whole church, so that the devil could take no advantage of us." Ephesians chapter 4 says, "And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers." People will say, well, we have apostles and prophets. Where are your apostles and prophets? Why don't you align with Christ's organizational model for the church? The problem with this is that the LDS Church doesn't align with this verse either. Joseph Smith claimed that an evangelist is a patriarch, even the oldest man of the blood of Joseph, or of the seed of Abraham. So does this mean that the LDS Church is in self-proclaimed apostasy? In this video, I'm going to walk through the history of the Presiding Patriarch and explain why it's possible this office might have been eliminated. I also want to consider the public explanation given for why it was done away with, because I think the LDS explanation for this might help shed some light on why we as evangelicals think it's okay that we don't have apostles and prophets. I would say that the late elimination of this office demonstrates that the LDS Church is inconsistent with its claims about a restoration. There may be prophets and apostles, there may be shepherds, teachers, but is there an evangelist? Not anymore.
This means we must fulfill the promise to our ancestors to do the ordinance work for them. If we do not, then our salvation may be in jeopardy.
In October of 1979, Eldred G. Smith, who had been the patriarch to the church for over 30 years, was called into President Spencer W. Kimball's office in the church office building in downtown Salt Lake City. For decades, he had been a general authority to the church. He had given patriarchal blessings to tens of thousands of people. He had spoken regularly in general conference. He had traveled around the world doing his work side by side with the apostles. But this office was highly unique amongst the general authorities. The reason? Well, it was the only office in the LDS Church that was inherited by bloodline. Eldred G. Smith was a descendant of Hyrum Smith, who was himself a presiding patriarch in the church. As Eldred Smith walked into Spencer Kimball's office, he had no idea what awaited him. Unbeknownst to him, the patriarch's office was about to be totally eliminated. When Smith got there, Kimball explained to him that he would be granted Patriarch Emeritus status. He would retain his office in the church office building and even his living expenses, but his official tenure as Church Patriarch was over. A couple of days later, at the October 1979 General Conference, it was officially announced that Eldred would be moved to Patriarch Emeritus status.
Because of the large increase in the number of state patriarchs and the availability of patriarchal service throughout the world, we now designate Eldred G. Smith as a Patriarch Emeritus, which means that he is honorably relieved, not released, of all duties, responsibilities pertaining to the office of Patriarch to the Church.
Well, according to Smith, this was shocking and devastating to him. He really loved his office. The reason given? Because of the large increase in the number of stake patriarchs and the availability of patriarchal service throughout the world. But was this really the reason? Some Latter-day Saints had reason to think that there was more going on here behind the scenes. In fact, the Salt Lake Tribune reported, "There has been speculation among the church members that the position of the patriarch to the church is being abolished, or that Patriarch Smith and his position are being placed on the shelf." Was the entire office going to be mothballed? After conference, Eldred Smith asked an apostle to clarify this for him. The answer he received was that it was the intent of the leadership of the church to retire the office, and that no one had been selected to replace him, even though this sentiment had not been communicated to the membership of the church at all. Eldred Smith retained his Patriarch Emeritus status until he died at the age of 106 in 2013. 106 is up there. I think he was the oldest Utahn living at the time when he passed away. No replacement was ever appointed, and thus Eldred G. Smith was officially the last patriarch to the LDS Church. But the question here is why? Why end an office that seemed to be so significant in the history of the LDS Church? Why end an office that both Joseph and Brigham had spoken about as being important? Well, the answer is surprisingly convoluted and spans over a century and a half of history in the LDS Church. Let's trace the trail of difficulties surrounding this troublesome and turbulent office from the beginning of the church in 1830. In the early years of the fledgling LDS Church, Joseph Smith Jr. was claiming to restore Christianity back to the original organizational structure of the church with prophets and apostles and the like. Well, he was also interested in restoring the organizational structure of the Old Testament people of God as well. And the patriarchs were a very significant part of the Old Testament narrative. In December of 1833, 2 years before the quorum of the 12 apostles was ever formally established, alleged prophet Joseph Smith Jr. appointed his father, Joseph Smith Sr., to the office of Church Patriarch. Let me read for you the blessing that Joseph Smith Jr. gave to his father in this role. He said, "He shall be called a prince over his posterity, holding the keys of the patriarchal priesthood over the kingdom of God on earth, even the church of the Latter-day Saints. And he shall sit in the general assembly of patriarchs, even in council with the Ancient of Days, when he shall sit, and all the patriarchs with him, and shall enjoy his right and authority under the direction of the Ancient of Days." Now, this statement given about Smith Sr. was more than just an honorary position, especially in the context of the Restoration. The Restoration had as its aim to restore every key, power, and authority ever dispensed from heaven to men on earth. So being given the keys to the patriarchal priesthood was, I think, especially significant. In 1836, Patriarch Smith Sr. gave a blessing to the entire first presidency of the church. Here's what History of the Church records happened in the temple in Kirtland. "We then laid our hands upon our aged father Smith and invoked the blessings of heaven. I then anointed his head with the consecrated oil and sealed many blessings upon him. The presidency then in turn laid their hands upon his head, beginning at the oldest until they had all laid their hands upon him, and pronounced such blessings upon his head as the Lord put into their hearts, all blessing him to be our patriarch, to anoint our heads, and to attend to all duties that pertain to that office. The presidency then took the seat in their turn, according to their age, beginning at the oldest, and received their anointing and blessing under the hands of Father Smith. And in my turn, my father anointed my head, and sealed upon me the blessings of Moses, to lead Israel in the latter days, even as Moses led him in days of old, also the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So he was blessed to be the patriarch and to attend to all duties which pertain to that office, duties which were never really clearly laid out. They certainly included patriarchal blessings, though. Now, for those who don't know, patriarchal blessings are personal revelations from God. The patriarch lays his hands on the head of the person seeking a blessing and pronounces blessings. Traditionally, the blessings contain an inspired and prophetic statement of the life mission of the recipient, together with such blessings, cautions, and admonitions that the patriarch may be prompted to give. Many of these early patriarchal blessings included incredible prophecies. A good number of these stated that the recipient would actually witness the return of Christ. Today, there are a host of local patriarchs that do this work, but at one point, the presiding patriarch was to be over all of these local patriarchs. As B.H. Roberts says, there should be a presiding patriarch over all the patriarchs of the church, and he is known as the presiding patriarch of the church, holding the keys of the patriarchal blessings upon the heads of the Lord's people, and he presides over, instructs, and directs the labors of all the patriarchs of the church. In accordance with this office, Smith Sr. would regularly give blessings where he would seal people up to eternal life. Now, this is a privilege that isn't just given to anyone, but presumably to someone who wielded real authority in the church. What's more, according to messenger and advocate, Joseph Smith Sr. would lead prayer meetings for the church on Thursday nights. In September of 1837, Joseph Smith Jr. said that Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith Sr., Hyrum Smith, and his uncle John Smith, and the three in the first presidency, quote, are to be considered the heads of the church. Now, it's worth noting that Oliver Cowdery took issue with the strength of this language. In fact, he made sure to clarify that Joseph Smith Jr., as the prophet of the Restoration, was the first patriarch in the church. But this is not something that was ever re-articulated or even affirmed by Joseph Smith Jr. himself. Patriarch Smith Sr. died in 1840. Before passing away, he laid his hands on the head of Hyrum Smith and commissioned on him the office of Presiding Patriarch. Earlier in 1833, Smith Sr. had blessed Hyrum by saying, "He shall stand in the tracts of his father, and be numbered among those who hold the right of patriarchal priesthood, even the evangelical priesthood, and power shall be upon him." LDS Prophet Joseph Smith's brother, Hyrum Smith, was now the patriarch. Quite a duo, those two, Joseph and Hyrum. And because they were siblings, the institutional relationship between president and patriarch was a little bit ambiguous. Now, this worked out just fine while the two of them were holding those offices. But once they died, the ambiguity got the LDS Church into quite a bit of trouble, laying the groundwork for some serious division down the road. Now, it's crazy. Details of Hyrum's appointment to this office of patriarch is actually found in D&C, Doctrine and Covenants 124. In that section, we read, "My servant Hyrum may take the office of priesthood and patriarch, which was appointed unto him by his father, by blessing and also by right." Now, that's significant. By blessing and by right. Remember that. "That from henceforth he shall hold the keys of the patriarchal blessings upon the heads of all my people. And from this time forth I appoint unto him that he may be a prophet and a seer and a revelator unto my church, as well as my servant Joseph, that he may act in concert also with my servant Joseph." Now, notice that Hyrum's status as prophet, seer, and revelator is tied with his position, which was given through the blessing of his father, Joseph Smith Sr. You can see why this becomes a problem down the road. In other words, Hyrum's status as prophet, seer, and revelator is tied to the fact that he inherited the office of patriarch. It gets even crazier than this. Later on in that same section, D&C 124, in a significant development for the organization of LDS Church government, the section says, "Verily I say unto you, I now give unto you the officers belonging to my priesthood, that ye may hold the keys thereof." Skip forward. "First, I give unto you Hyrum Smith to be patriarch unto you, to hold the sealing blessings of my church, even the Holy Spirit of promise, whereby ye are sealed up unto the day of redemption." 125, "I give unto you my servant Joseph to be a presiding elder over all my church, to be a translator, a revelator, a seer, a prophet. I gave unto him for counselors my servant Cindy Rigdon and my servant William Law, that these may constitute a quorum and first presidency, to receive the oracles for the whole church. I give unto you Brigham Young, the 12, So Hyrum, as the church patriarch, was the first to be sustained among the leadership to the church, even before Joseph Smith himself, by virtue of him being the church patriarch. Joseph himself even said, he claimed that the patriarchal office is the highest office in the church. This has incredible ramifications for when Joseph and Hyrum die. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Apostle LeGrand Richards noted, "The importance of this calling is evident from the fact that the Lord, by revelation, took Hyrum Smith, the brother of the prophet Joseph Smith, out of the first presidency of the church and called him to be patriarch of the church." So he was called out of the first presidency into a higher calling, the office of patriarch. This one just blew my mind. On July 16th, 1843, just a year before Joseph Smith would die, he preached a sermon saying that he would not prophesy anymore, and proposed Hyrum to hold the office of prophet to the church, as was his birthright. "I'm going to have a reformation," he said, "and the saints must regard Hyrum, for he has the authority that I might be a priest of the Most High God." As it was his birthright. So Hyrum was proposed to hold the office of prophet as was his birthright. The only office that Hyrum held by virtue of his birthright was the office of the Church Patriarch. Joseph seems here to be alluding to this idea that Hyrum, as the Patriarch, actually has authority over Joseph himself. Now, Joseph would walk this back a little bit, but still, the fact that he made this claim at all in the first place is, I think, pretty incredible. The Millennial Star in 1842 wrote that the first presidency of the Mormon hierarchy consists of 4 dignitaries: principal prophet, a patriarch, and 2 counselors. The patriarch was seen as a member of the first presidency. That was certainly not the case in just a few short years after this. My point in bringing all this up is that the office of presiding patriarch was not some obscure office tucked in the back of the LDS Church hierarchy. In the days of Joseph and Hyrum, it rose to incredible levels of authority. It was seen as an indispensable office of the Restoration. The seeds of division had been laid in the very foundation of this office. And with the death of Joseph and Hyrum in 1844, the office of patriarch became a spark that led to deep division and infighting amongst the Latter-day Saints. Who is to become the next leader of the church? Well, there's at least some reason to think that perhaps it should have been the patriarch. While various people were vying for leadership in the LDS Church, Brigham Young, the leader of the Quorum of the 12 at that time, said that the 12 should lead the church under his watchful eye. Part of his claim for legitimate leadership was that he was prepared to appoint the next patriarch over the church. In fact, he was prepared to do that even before considering who to appoint as the next president. Young said, "Do you want a patriarch for the whole church? To this we are perfectly willing. Do you want a patriarch? Here is Brother William Smith left. Here is Uncle John Smith, uncle to the Prophet Joseph Smith left. It is their right. The right of patriarchal blessings belongs to the Smith family." Though there were other potentials, William Smith, the last surviving son of Joseph Smith Sr., was chosen to be the presiding patriarch. Now, you have to understand that William Smith at this time was also an apostle, which led some people to believe that holding both the office of apostle and patriarch, he should be the next rightful leader of the church. Times and Seasons, a newspaper in Nauvoo, wrote of William Smith in December of 1844, "It will be his privilege when he arrives to be ordained to the office of patriarch to the church, and to occupy the place that his brother Hyrum did when living, and he will stand in the same relationship to the 12 as his brother Hyrum did to the first presidency after he was ordained patriarch." Now, this did not go over very well with the 12. You see, Hyrum had enjoyed a position of authority, a kind of prominence in the church, likely because he was the brother of Joseph Smith, but Joseph attributed this to Hyrum's office of patriarch. So when the apostles were thinking about William Smith holding the office of patriarch, they weren't very eager to see William preside in authority over them. Even though this is what would have happened had Hyrum been in that office, William Smith was not Hyrum Smith. Regardless of all of these concerns, in May of 1845, nearly an entire year after Joseph and Hyrum had been killed, William Smith was appointed patriarch over the church. He instructed the Latter-day Saints, quote, "support and uphold the proper authorities of the church. When I say authorities, I mean the whole and not a part. The 12, and not 1, 2, 6, 8, 10, or 11, but the whole 12 follow me as I follow Christ." Notice the language there. The 12 follow me as I follow Christ. Well, the apostles were very aware of the implications of this statement, so they responded rather quickly. In the next edition of Times and Seasons, John Taylor, who would go on to be the 3rd president in the LDS Church, he responded to William's claims. He made clear that the apostles saw that William was patriarch not over the whole church, but rather patriarch to the church. And he made very clear that William wasn't to be given this high position of authority that Hyrum once held prior to William's own appointment. He also stated very clearly that the authority of the patriarch fell underneath the authority of the 12, not above it. And William was to have priority and presidency over the patriarchs, and he was to hold all the keys of the patriarchal priesthood, presiding over the Council of Patriarchs, but he was not going to inherit leadership over the entire church. Now, John Taylor's statements marked a clear departure from the precedent that had been set under Hyrum Smith's tenure. But things get even more heated because nearly a month later, Lucy Smith, who's Joseph's mother, claimed to have a vision wherein God told her that William was to be the next leader of the church. Check this out. Here's what the revelation supposedly said. Thy son William, he shall have power over the churches. He is father in Israel over the patriarchs and the whole of the church. He is the last of the lineage that is raised up in these last days. He is patriarch to regulate the affairs of the church. He is president. The presidency of the church belongs to William, he being the last of the heads of the church according to the lineage, he having inherited it from the family from before the foundation of the world. Brother and children, I want you to take notice that the burden of the church rests on William. Well, Brigham and the rest of the 12 dealt very quickly with this, and they sought to find a solution that would appease Lucy Smith. They wanted to be in her good graces, and it appears that they did. But William Smith was not so easily convinced that he should not have this level of authority. After Brigham smoothed things over with Lucy Mack Smith, William responded to John Taylor's article in a letter to Young. He wrote, I have often said it was my wish that you should stand as the president of the church, but I claim to be patriarch over the whole church. This gives me my place and proper standing and what I inherit, no man being my head. I want all men to understand that my father's family are of the royal blood and promised seed. And the public perception eventually turned against William, so much so that in October's General Conference in 1845, Parley Pratt said of Patriarch William Smith, I have proof positive that he is an aspiring man, that he aspires to uproot and undermine the legal presidency of the church, that he may occupy the place himself. In the second place, while Brother William was in the East, his doctrine and conduct have not had a savory influence, but have produced death and destruction wherever he went. So he didn't have very kind things to say about William Smith. Accordingly, in this conference, William Smith was officially excommunicated from the church by unanimous vote. So not only had this office been reduced in its authority by the 12, but now it was viewed with a certain degree of skepticism and trepidation. Would this controversy happen again later down the road? Would there be other patriarchs who would seek to seize power? Well, after William Smith's catastrophic tenure as presiding patriarch, the 12 were not eager to give this office the same kind of authority that it had once had. In this period of instability, the presiding patriarch was a total wild card. Apostleship could be granted to those who were deemed worthy, but the patriarch was determined by bloodline. Who knows who could end up in that office and what they would seek to do? I mean, because of its hereditary nature, it by definition introduced the potential for division, the potential for someone to challenge the established status quo of the church. Well, this began a century-long back and forth regarding this office and what degree of authority it should have in the church. After Joseph and Hyrum died, the LDS Church actually operated for a few years without a first presidency at all. They were very patient in appointing a new president to lead the church. But eventually, they did desire to re-establish a first presidency. On December 23rd, 1847, the church leader stated, having it in contemplation soon to reorganize the church according to the original pattern with the first presidency and patriarch, what the statement is telling us is that they saw the original pattern of the church to include the first presidency and the patriarch. And so they did. They reorganized the church with Brigham Young as the second president of the church, and they also appointed a new patriarch. This time, it was John Smith, who was Joseph Smith Jr.'s uncle, Smith Sr.'s brother. He was appointed to be the new patriarch to the whole church. Brigham later claimed that the kingdom is set up, and you have the perfect pattern, and you can lead the kingdom in at the gate. So the structure of the church was set. You have the first presidency, you have the patriarch, you have the quorum of the 12. This was, according to Brigham, the proper pattern of the organization of the church. Yet already, even at this early stage, Brigham Young was downplaying the prominence of this office. When John Smith was ordained to be presiding patriarch, Brigham Young placed the order of his being sustained after the first presidency, still before the 12. But if you remember from what I read earlier in D&C 124, he was supposed to be sustained first, even before the president of the church himself. Well, in the ordination, John Smith was to receive all the keys and authority pertaining to this calling, that thou mayst be a presiding officer over this priesthood. Uncle John Smith was content to follow Brigham, and through the rest of his life, there were no major controversies concerning the degree of authority that the office of presiding patriarch was supposed to have. He died in 1854. After his tenure, Hyrum Smith's oldest son, also called John Smith, which is just kind of confusing, was appointed to the office. Now, notably, when he was sustained after the 12 were sustained, pushing that sustaining order even further down the line, still in defiance of the indicated order given in D&C 124. John Smith really struggled to keep the word of wisdom, which had become much more strict later on, and he still had really close familial ties with the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS, most notably Joseph Smith III. And he was also criticized by church leaders for not celebrating polygamy and plural marriage as much as they would have hoped. All of these things kind of came together to make him not very popular amongst church leaders at that time. Despite this, John Smith eventually presided over a quorum of patriarchs. He was to appoint them, to direct them, to instruct them in all their duties. This was part of what it meant to be the presiding patriarch, to be in charge of the local patriarchs. Third president of the church, John Taylor, said of John Smith in conference, "We have a man who stands at the head of the patriarchal order in our church. That man is Brother John Smith. He always sits here with the first presidency of the church. Why is it that he occupies this exalted position when sitting before the people in their general conferences? It is because the Lord acknowledges a patriarch as a man who is endowed with a very high office in the church and kingdom of God, and who has a special endowment given unto him for a special purpose." John Smith was also the brother of Joseph F. Smith, who would become the 6th president of the LDS Church in 1901. Joseph F. Smith felt convicted that the patriarch should be the one to appoint him. So he requested that his brother, John Smith, the patriarch, be the one to appoint him to the office of the presidency of the LDS Church. President Joseph F. Smith commented, "And we did it strictly in accordance with the pattern the Lord has established in this church." Joseph F. Smith was the only prophet who claimed that the patriarch had the authority to appoint and ordain the president of the church. He also argued that, going back to D&C 124, the patriarch should be sustained before anyone else, even before the president himself. Patriarch John Smith was afforded more authority than his predecessor had had, and he was affirmed as a prophet and seer and a revelator to the church, and he traveled even to fulfill his particular duties as the presiding patriarch. I mean, this was kind of a renaissance of the presiding patriarch, not quite to the level that it was in the days of Joseph and Hyrum, but still much higher than it had been at any other point since. But the quorum of the 12 was not thrilled with Joseph F. Smith elevating this office to this degree. And just like Joseph and Hyrum were brothers, Joseph F. Smith and John Smith were brothers, and so maybe some of the difficulties that come with specific authority didn't come up as much, but the 12 saw looking into the future that this would be an issue again. After Joseph F. Smith's death in 1918, the first presidency clarified that moving forward, the presiding patriarch of the church ranks in the order of office between the Council of the 12 and the First Council of the 70. Patriarch John Smith died in 1911, several years before his brother would die, and his grandson Hyrum Smith took the office of presiding patriarch. Seriously, these guys and their names, it's really hard to keep this all straight, but John Smith was the son of Hyrum Smith, and John Smith's grandson was Hyrum Smith, who is now the next presiding patriarch over the church. After Hyrum's appointment to office, the Improvement Era, the church's official magazine at the time, wrote, "The presiding patriarch holds the keys of the patriarchal blessings upon the heads of all the people. It is his duty also to preside over all the evangelical ministers or patriarchs of the whole church." The next LDS president, Eldred G. really firmly believed that the presiding patriarch should not be determined by bloodline or family descent. And he also wanted to remove the various administrative responsibilities given to the presiding patriarch. One of the things that he did was he moved the patriarch from near the first presidency down between the 12 and the 70 in conference. He was no longer sitting next to the first presidency. After Hyrum Smith's death in 1932, Heber J. Grant was firmly opposed to making his son Eldred the new presiding patriarch. But the Quorum of the 12 strongly disagreed. They felt that the patriarch should remain something that stayed in the Smith family. Instead of removing the hereditary right to the office, the 12 wanted to strip the presiding patriarch of all of its administrative duties. For an entire decade, for 10 years, the president and the Quorum of the 12 couldn't agree on exactly what to do with the office of presiding patriarch, and so there was none from the years of 1932 to 1942. Well, a compromise was eventually reached, which greatly stripped the administrative responsibilities of the presiding patriarch. And it was also determined that the next patriarch could be called from any of the descendants of the Smith family, not just the eldest son of the prior patriarch. Well, what this meant was that practically the patriarch of the church would no longer be presiding over all of the local patriarchs. After 10 years of a stalemate, Joseph F. Smith II was installed as the next presiding patriarch. Joseph F. Smith II's tenure in this office lasted only 4 years when he was unceremoniously released for some unexplained reason. It was at this time that the office formally changed from being called presiding patriarch to patriarch to the church. After Joseph F. Smith II was released, Eldred G. Smith, who was the son of Hyrum Smith, was called to be the final patriarch of the church. It was Eldred G. Smith who would be called into Spencer Kimball's office in October of 1979, and it was Eldred G. Smith that would see the sunset of this office in its entirety. This story is so truncated, and it just kind of touches on the highest level issues. I cut out tons of back and forth memos and notes and meetings discussing this issue. There was lots of controversy around it over the years, always having to do with what degree of authority should we give this office that essentially we can't control, the holder of the office being determined by bloodline. There were times when the patriarch was stripped of all of his administrative duties and times when the administrative duties were restored. There were times where it seemed like he'd be getting more authority, but then wouldn't. I mean, it's just all over the board. Despite how, in some ways, anemic this overview was, hopefully it paints a picture for you. The presiding patriarch office was a conundrum in the LDS Church. It was a high office that introduced an unstable element into the upper echelons of the LDS Church. We don't know for sure why the office was eliminated in 1979. Maybe the reason given in conference really was the reason. They thought that they have the local patriarchs, we no longer need this figurehead anymore, though personally I struggle to believe that's the whole story. Maybe it was just because the boundaries and the authority and the role of this office just weren't clearly defined. From my perspective, it certainly seems as though the decision to eliminate this office was more a function of practical control than it was spiritual direction. Kind of a side note, the infighting and the lack of agreement between the apostles and the presidents is really odd and striking to me. I mean, if these really are apostles and prophets of God's church, you think that there would be some degree of agreement and consistency between their views on this issue. I mean, the difference between Joseph F. Smith and Heber J. Grant is extreme. It's like whiplash, one extreme to the other. That, to me, makes it seem like these guys really aren't receiving revelation about these issues. They're just men trying to organize in accordance with the wisdom that they have. I think it raises the question, are these men really being led by God? Why do I make this video at all? Why do I bring this up? Well, because I argue that using Mormonism's own standards, the elimination of this office means that the LDS Church is in some kind of apostasy, where certain keys have been lost, where positions of authority have been lost. It is kind of the same category that a lot of people say about Christianity, that Christianity in the past lost keys and authority to do the things that we were supposed to be doing. Well, there's no longer a presiding patriarch. And he was given all the keys of the patriarchal priesthood. What happened to that? The cessation of this office flies in the face of the idea that Joseph Smith had restored everything that had been lacking in Christianity. If the presiding patriarch had been lacking in Christianity and then Joseph restored it, why is it currently missing in the LDS Church? And conversely, if it was non-essential, why was it restored and claimed to be so essential in the early days of the church? Joseph, Brigham, other prophets certainly spoke about this office as though it was a significant part of the restoration. Whenever the Church of Christ is established in the earth, there should be a patriarch. That's what Joseph said. Latter-day Saints aim all their guns at Christians and say, why don't you guys have all the offices of the early church? But I might ask, why don't you? Apostles, you have. Prophets, you have. Evangelist? Not a presiding evangelist, not a presiding patriarch anymore. It's a perplexing situation to me that such a high office, a general authority's position, could simply be eliminated. By the standards that LDS leaders have given, the end of the presiding patriarch's office would seem to indicate that the modern LDS Church is in a state of apostasy. Now, I anticipate that Latter-day Saints might respond by saying, well, maybe we don't have a presiding evangelist anymore, but we do have evangelists, we do have local patriarchs who carry on the substance and the essence of this work. And that's a great point. It's something I really want to talk about, because I think the way that Latter-day Saints think about that is the same way that we as Christians think about the office of apostle and prophet. The reason given in conference for why Eldred Smith was given emeritus status was because of the availability of patriarchal service throughout the world. In other words, the high office was no longer needed because he functioned as a pioneer, as someone who established the work. The substance of the work, the substance of the ministry continues on a local level, administered by local patriarchs who carry on the work. We're told in Ephesians 2 that the household of God is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Now, we like making the point that a foundation is the very base. It's not something that you continue laying. It's the initial part of the work, and then all the walls are being built around it. So we do believe that the church is continuing to be built, but the foundation has been once for all laid. This pioneering work has already been done. In the first century, we believe that the essential ministry that the apostles were undertaking in the first century is being carried on in a local and more limited sense by local pastors. Pastors are doing the work that the apostles initially did. So we don't need this ongoing office of apostle and prophet in the modern age. We are given the Holy Spirit to guide us and direct us, to give us wisdom in the management of the church, who gives us words to speak to the church in the context of, in terms of pastors, in the context of teaching and shepherding and instructing and building up, in the context of just church members to encourage one another and teach one another and point one another back to Christ. This entire narrative shows that the logic that we use is not absurd. The logic that Christians use for the fulfillment of these offices is exactly the same logic that Latter-day Saints are using. We carry on the work of apostles and prophets in local ministry. As a side note, it's very bizarre to me that Joseph Smith identified evangelist as the office of patriarch. To again quote what he said, an evangelist is a patriarch, even the oldest man of the blood of Joseph or of the seed of Abraham. The word for evangelist in Greek is euangelistes. It's very much related to the word euangelion, which is the word for gospel. So I'd argue that an evangelist is someone who preaches or heralds the gospel, someone who shares the gospel. I don't really see how it refers to patriarch, but it's not really relevant for this video. I just think it's kind of interesting. If you're at all interested in this entire topic of the Presiding Patriarch, I recommend the book Lost Legacy, The Mormon Office of Presiding Patriarch. I took most of my stuff here from that book. It's a really good overview of the issues, a good overview of kind of the history, and could be very interesting for you to check out. Also, if you want to understand more about why Christians don't have modern prophets and how we biblically justify that, I'm going to link this video here where we kind of walk through more systematically, more theologically and biblically why we don't think we need a modern prophet. Could be interesting for you. Be sure to leave any questions or comments or thoughts down below in the comments, and I'd really like to hear if you have objections to my logic in this video, what they are. I want to understand. I've never really talked with anyone about this issue. I'd love to hear your thoughts and discuss this a little bit more with you down below in the comments. Thanks so much for watching.